In the past couple of weeks, the skies over Russia have been filled with strange objects. And we're not talking about aliens or indeed a red sun or a Superman. Rather, the objects sighted over Russia have been drones, cheap one-way drones manufactured en masse in Ukraine as part of Kiev's strategy of asymmetric warfare. And while these drones have attacked air bases and depots over the last fortnight, there's been one clear preference for targets, and that's oil refineries. According to Russian opposition outlet Insider, by March 20th, 15 drones had successfully struck 13 refineries across 9 regions of Russia. Some of these strikes have been minor, a bit of damage that's easily fixed, drones that are shot down before they can reach anything important. Other strikes, though, have been nothing short of spectacular. The Kiev Independent offers a partial list. Fires at refineries in Krasnodar Krai and Samara, huge explosions at facilities in Kaluga and Oryol, an attack on Nizhny Novgorod that was so successful the state energy company Lukoil was forced to halt processing there. Since many of these attacks coincided with Russia's sham election last weekend, some observers have dismissed them as propaganda stunts, Ukrainian attempts to disrupt Vladimir Putin's 5th coronation, and nothing more than that. Indeed, this was the line Putin himself took, telling state-owned Rosail 1, "The main goal, I have no doubt about it, is to, if not disrupt the presidential elections in Russia, then at least somehow interfere with the normal process of expressing the will of citizens." Others, though, sense a deeper strategy, one designed to not just create a sense of unease among ordinary Russians, but to alter the course of the war by devastating the Kremlin's economic engine. As Bloomberg put it, Ukraine's fight against Russia's invasion has entered a new phase, pitting homegrown drone technology against a 2,000-kilometer swath of largely Soviet-era oil facilities. For those who've been following the war closely, calling these attacks a new phase might seem a little gratuitous. After all, Ukraine first used drones to hit a Russian oil facility back in 2022. Since then, there have been multiple high-profile drone attacks inside Russia, including one last spring that grazed the roof of the Kremlin. What's different about these latest strikes is their sheer scale, one made possible by recent heavy investments by Kiev into drone manufacturing. The result has been a fleet of autonomous aircraft that are comically weak to look at, almost like World War I Spitfires without a pilot, but fulfill a lot of functions that higher-end kit couldn't. First, the drones are fully autonomous. Because Russia excels these days at electronic warfare, these drones are capable of flying hundreds of kilometers and zeroing in on a target without using any electronic communication. Second, they can carry serious explosive charges, serious enough to potentially damage a sprawling oil refinery. Thirdly, and perhaps most importantly of all, they are incredibly cheap. Bloomberg estimates that Ukraine's newest drones are 40 times cheaper than the missiles Russian air defenses uses to knock them out of the sky. That means even an intercepted drone is cost-effective, since its destruction leaves Moscow financially worse off. Of course, though, getting shot out of the sky isn't what Ukraine's specialized unmanned systems forces want from their drones. No, they want them to hit the Kremlin where it really hurts, right in Russia's oil-based economy. The actual effect of this campaign is so far a little difficult to measure, given that Moscow is incentivized to underreport damage, while Kiev is incentivized to overreport it. That being said, we do have some tools that we can use to assess the impact here. One is the amount of oil that Russia is exporting. The Kiev Independent reports that seaborne exports of crude oil fell by 340,000 barrels a day in January, following a successful strike on the coastal Rosneft plant in Tuapse. Another is to monitor overall production levels. Speaking to the Financial Times, energy analysts at Kepler suggested that refinery production in Russia has fallen from 5.6 million barrels a day to 5.2 million. Although that number later increased, it was before the latest wave of strikes. Bloomberg currently estimates that 11% of Russia's total oil refinery capacity has now been taken offline. The Financial Times puts the number closer to 14%. Finally, we can track the impact of these strikes by looking at the Russian domestic market. In mid-February, after prices for gasoline and diesel surged on the St. Petersburg exchange, the Kremlin banned all exports of gasoline until August 31st to keep prices from jumping at the pump. In this, Moscow succeeded. For regular drivers, the attacks have yet to translate into a more expensive commute. Still, that might not stay the case for long, especially if Ukraine is serious about this being a new, large-scale campaign of air attacks. With so many oil refineries refineries on its territory, the vast majority in the European part of Russia closest to Ukraine. The New York Times points out that it is impossible for the Kremlin to protect them all with air defenses, and that makes them excellent targets. And while the idea that these attacks could starve the Russian army of fuel is likely pretty wishful thinking, a sustained campaign could certainly cause wild price swings for ordinary Russians at the fuel pump. They could also dampen exports, lowering the astronomical sums Moscow is able to make selling its hydrocarbons to China and India. At the very least, repeated attacks might hurt the pockets of the oligarchs, helping to keep Putin in power. A Ukrainian reserves officer who posts under the nickname Targami wrote on X that intensifying the destruction of strategic assets that yield substantial profits for their owners serves as a potent signal that war is detrimental to business interests. Or as the head of drone manufacturer Terminal Autonomy cheerfully told reporters, Russia is a gas station with an army, and we intend on destroying that gas station. Of course, it will take many, many successful strikes for Russia's oligarchs or ordinary citizens to start feeling the pinch. Nor can Ukraine afford to space out the gaps between attacks, lest engineers have time to fix the damage caused by previous drones. While an abundance of complicated, specialized machinery means it can take several months to repair a damaged refinery, Russia's economy will only suffer if Kyiv can push up the tempo of these strikes. Speaking to the Kyiv Independent, analyst Michael Kaufman noted that there's a substantial number of these types of facilities within the likely range or probabilistic range of Ukrainian strike capabilities, but much will depend on the extent to which Ukraine can scale up the campaign. These doubts aren't for Kyiv's lack of trying. Digital Transformation Minister Mikhailo Fedorov, whose brief includes overseeing drone production, said on Wednesday that with financial help, Ukraine could manufacture 2 million drones a year. But it's far from certain that this financial help will be forthcoming. Luckily for Kyiv, there are other upsides to this long-range strike campaign, silver linings in case the economic part winds up being a big, dark cloud of failure. Of these, the most obvious is the psychological aspect. Although the Russian government is trying to discourage the sharing of footage from such attacks on Telegram, sharing images of burning refineries is absolutely what people do. That not only acts as a reminder to a mostly sheltered population that their nation is at war, but it also shows them how impotent their government is. Sergei Vakulenko at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace pointed out how strange it was that the Kremlin has been unable to stop these strikes, telling the Financial Times, surprisingly, Russia cannot counter such a relatively simple weapon as drones. Such incompetence may have some impact on the population. I mean, can you imagine the outcry against President Biden if Russia blew up a single refinery on US soil, let alone 13 of them? As analyst John Helen put it on X, Ukraine is successfully strangling the Russian war economy in a manner that Russia has no answer to, democratizing modern warfare with low-cost, long-range drones, hitting Putin where it hurts and doing it in a way that's visible to the Russian domestic audience. A less obvious upside could be keeping the Ukraine war at the top of lawmakers' minds as Congress tries to agree on additional funding. At the time of writing, that's Wednesday, House Speaker Mike Johnson still has not allowed a floor vote on the Senate bill that would allocate an additional $60 billion of desperately needed funds to Ukraine's fight against Russia, as well as smaller sums to help Israel and Taiwan. While Johnson has said he'll allow a vote on some version of the bill after a deal is agreed to fund the US government, Kyiv is clearly worried that he'd prefer to just ignore the war altogether. That's harder for him to do if every other day brings new front-page headlines about explosions in Russia. And finally, there's the matter of air defenses. Russia has already redeployed Panzer systems to cover major refineries. Ukraine may be hoping that Moscow pulls enough of them away from the front to reduce its forces' air cover. Still, for all the potential these strikes have to damage Russia in multiple ways, potential is really all it is right now. To illustrate, just look at the surprisingly modest impact on the global oil market so far. According to Bloomberg, while benchmark European diesel prices have also gained, they remain below the levels seen in February at the height of the Houthi attacks on Red Sea shipping. Were Ukraine to seriously damage Moscow's output, we'd expect to see wild swings, not just on the Russian domestic market, but on global markets too, which might be why Kyiv hasn't yet tried to truly cripple Russia's energy sector. Speaking to Bloomberg, a research director for short-term oils at consultant Wood Mackenzie pointed out that if Ukraine wanted to escalate its pressure on Russian oil refining revenue, they would target the key product export terminal infrastructure at the ports of Primorsk or Novosibirsk. Hitting these mail oil export terminals are what would really hurt Russia, far more so than blowing up refineries. The downside is that the shock to the global system would also cause price hikes in Europe and America, potentially pissing off Ukraine's closest allies. For the time being then, the strike campaign seems likely to continue as it has these past weeks, targeting refineries far behind Russian lines. Indeed, Zelensky himself seemed to promise as much, recently telling reporters that, quote, "These weeks have demonstrated to many that the Russian war machine has vulnerabilities that we can reach with our weapons. What our own drones are capable of is a true Ukrainian long-range capability. Ukraine will now always have a strike force in the sky." Yet even if Kyiv succeeds in making its hoped-for 2 million drones, and even if these long-range strikes exceed everyone's wildest expectations, we should be clear that this is not the silver bullet that will lead to a Ukrainian victory. With its forces desperately low on artillery ammunition, air defense interceptors, and fresh recruits, Ukraine is still in danger of being pushed back on land, of losing territory, even as its drone teams score major victories in the air and across the Black Sea. As Michael Kaufman put it, the deep battle is meant to degrade and suppress, and is not a substitute for ground operations. Success in such a campaign should be seen as part of a broader strategy, but not misrepresented as a war-winning approach on its own. Whether Ukraine receives the funding and material to make its land strategy as successful as its drone operations will depend entirely on our leaders here in the West. But for now, Kyiv can at least claim a minor victory in its long and brutal war of self-defense. In our next story today, we travel to the Gaza Strip, where the Israel-Hamas war is now creeping up on the 6-month mark amidst a worsening backdrop of food insecurity, mass displacement, and human suffering on a massive scale. As war rages between the militant terror organization, Hamas, and an indiscriminate and increasingly devastating Israeli counteroffensive, ordinary Palestinians in Gaza have a lot more to fear than just bullets. In the last weeks, warnings from around the world have grown increasingly dire that if something doesn't change in Gaza soon, starvation may claim the lives of hundreds of thousands of people long before any war does. The food shortages in Gaza are worst in the territory's northern areas, where some 300,000 people are still trying to survive after a massive Israeli operation claims to have cleared Hamas from the area. There, according to prominent international aid organizations, famine is now considered imminent. In total, 677,000 people in Gaza are now staring down the barrel at starvation, with Israel's anticipated military offensive in the south only expected to spike that number even higher. Said Jeremy Konyadik, head of Refugees International, quote, "In my 25 years as a humanitarian, this may be, pound for pound, the grimmest analysis I have ever seen," end quote. Israel continues to apply extreme pressure on the Hamas organization by depriving Hamas and ordinary Gazans alike of food, even as the United Nations, Oxfam, and other relief organizations roundly condemn Israel's decision to essentially impose extreme food insecurity as an element of its ongoing war. According to Gaza's health ministry, which operates under the jurisdiction of Hamas, at least 27 people have already died of malnutrition and dehydration at the time of writing, most of them children. For northern Gaza to pass into outright famine would be a devastating benchmark to reach. For that to happen, 1 in 5 households in the area must be considered basically incapable of feeding themselves with anything of nutritional or caloric value. Nearly 1 in 3 children must be acutely malnourished, and out of every 10,000 people, at least 2 adults or 4 children must starve to death each day. According to the Integrated Food Security Phase Classification Initiative, an international organization that was built to assess this sort of thing, the only condition missing so far in northern Gaza is the rate of fatalities by starvation, which current projections indicate will happen by May at the latest. The first criterion, the percentage of households suffering extreme food shortage, isn't just 20%, it's estimated at closer to 70%. And making matters worse, the situation in northern Gaza mirrors historical conditions in which, once a place tips over into famine, it doesn't just maintain the minimum criteria to be a famine. The effect cascades, and very quickly, mass numbers of people begin to die. With Israel's control over Gaza so complete, any large-scale intervention was going to have to come from one of Israel's major backers on the world stage, most likely the United States, whose UN Security Council veto and political backing have provided much of the diplomatic cover for Israel's war thus far. The first promise of that intervention came from American President Joe Biden, who during a major national address indicated that the United States would build a temporary pier to supply Gaza with aid by sea. Gaza has no ports or piers of its own, and the US and other nations have been reticent to build one without Israel's approval. But per Biden's address, that hesitancy is no longer an issue. 36 hours after Biden's announcement, the first logistical support ship had already left its American base to steam toward Gaza, and in the United States, efforts are now underway 24 hours a day to work on prefabricating components of the pier for assembly off the Gaza coast. The American administration has pledged to its own people that no US boots will be on the ground in Gaza. Instead, their 1,800-foot or half-kilometer-long floating dock will be built on the ocean and linked to a separate causeway, which will then be pushed up against the beach. This sort of system has been used by the US before, in Kuwait, Haiti, and elsewhere. Although a specific timeline on when that pier will be ready has remained elusive, its intention is to eventually facilitate the delivery of 2 million meals a day to Gaza, an incredible volume of food that, despite how large it sounds, is still barely enough to keep such a massive population from starving. And while the American announcement sent a powerful signal to Gaza that the end, at least, of extreme hunger may now be in sight, it also had a knock-on effect. Put simply, it was an informal green light to other nations and organizations that the delivery of humanitarian aid by sea was now an option. Before long, aid organizations had responded with a pilot project. The groups responsible were World Central Kitchen, an American non-governmental organization, NGO, and a charity from Spain called Open Arms. Together, the organizations piled nearly 200 tons of food onto a ship called the Open Arms as it sat in port in Cyprus, a short sea voyage away from Gaza. Included in the shipment are goods from staples like rice, flour, and lentils to critical protein in the form of canned fish, meat, and beans. The United Arab Emirates signed onto the project by agreeing to fund the delivery of another 500 tons of aid if the first delivery was successful, and after clearing some red tape inside Cyprus, the ship set sail on the 12th of March. As the ship continued on its voyage toward Gaza, World Central Kitchen worked to set up its own jetty to receive it. That's a much smaller effort than what the US government hopes to achieve, but a substantial effort in its own right. World Central Kitchen has stated that it will use material from destroyed buildings and rubble in order to stretch the jetty far enough that ships can use it despite the shallow waters off the Gaza coast. The group's own social media suggests that bulldozers are hard at work leveling ground close to the Mediterranean. Meanwhile, more aid organizations and world governments have lined up behind the project in hopes that a successful delivery and the completion of the promised jetty will clear the way for large-scale delivery operations even before the United States' pier is complete. Israel, for its part, has now announced that it welcomes such deliveries, conditional on Israel's right to inspect the cargo before it leaves Cyprus. According to European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, it's the first time that Israel has allowed a ship to deliver aid to Gaza since it withdrew from and blockaded the territory nearly 2 decades ago in 2005. By the time the Open Arms ship arrived, World Central Kitchen's jetty was already complete. On March the 15th, the ship transferred the barge it was towing, that barge carrying about 200 tons of food aid, to a pair of smaller ships that towed it to the jetty successfully. The aid was offloaded and moved to land, where a plan for effective distribution is still remaining elusive amidst the sheer number of people in need. Although 200 tons of food aid is a lot by any metric, it's also only the equivalent of about 10 trucks of food, which itself is just 2% of the food aid that international organizations say that Gaza needs every day. In Cyprus, a second ship waits to make the voyage to Gaza, although at the time of writing it's still waiting on favorable weather. That ship will tow 300 tons of aid, not 200, which, don't get us wrong, is definitely an improvement, but it is nowhere near enough. Even despite the limited early success of this makeshift jetty and the major anticipated aid deliveries that may come by way of the United States and other world nations, the reality on the ground is that any maritime or air delivery of aid is simply not the most effective route to alleviate starvation. Deliveries by land route are still far more practical and effective, and yet Israel, despite its forceful claims to the contrary, refuses to deliver sufficient aid to the parts of Gaza that need it most. Proponents of Israel's ongoing offensive have often claimed that the country's minimal deliveries do still include enough food to keep people from the brink of starvation. But the simple fact that this food is present inside Gaza means nothing, whether it should be sufficient or not, if it's not being distributed. The reasons for a lack of proper distribution are twofold. On the one hand, Israel's aid convoys moving through the Gaza Strip are prone to being stopped and looted by desperate Gazans, many of whom see stopping a passing aid convoy as their only shot at getting the food. That's now led to multiple mass casualty incidents around aid convoys, which have alternately been mourned as tragic accidents by some and condemned as massacres by others. We've actually published a separate video recently on the largest of those incidents if you'd like to learn more about that. The The second issue, though, is Israel's simultaneous refusal to bring food aid to places that it considers dangerous, and its refusal to allow Palestinian or international organizations to handle distribution of aid in places where Israel doesn't want its troops put at risk. On its face, Israel's refusal to let Palestinians assist with the aid distribution process may look like just another tool to put pressure on Hamas. In practice, that's meant that hundreds of thousands of people in northern Gaza have been reduced to eating leaves and animal feed in order to survive because of Israel's direct refusal to provide the aid it claims to have allotted for the area. Nor have any of the alternatives been promising. The United States, Jordan, France, Germany, and other nations have begun a campaign of airdrops into Gaza in order to deliver aid, but those governments and international aid organizations alike all admit that such methods are highly inefficient to distribute food and critical supplies. Not only that, but the amounts airdropped so far are just a drop in the bucket compared to how much aid is actually needed to fend off mass starvation. On the 8th of March, the world received a grisly reminder of the danger of aid airdrops too. On that day, 5 people were crushed and killed by a falling pallet of aid when its parachute had failed to open. Aside from airdrops, Israel has considered solving the aid issue through a different route, going to international security contractors, particularly American ones, to solicit paramilitary protection for aid convoys. Any progress on that, however, is yet unannounced to the public at the time of writing. When Israel has allowed small convoys into northern Gaza on exceptionally limited occasions, those convoys have been forced to distribute their food quickly to whoever's closest to the point of entry and then get out. Far from justification of Israel's policy to restrict aid travel, those results speak to a far more obvious and discouraging reality that when mass numbers of people are starving and have no reason to trust that aid will be delivered with any degree of regularity or efficiency, they'll try and take what's in front of them to survive. Elsewhere, across the Israel-Hamas war, there are few signs that a stop to the violence will come anytime soon. At the time of writing, Israel is eyeing a large-scale offensive into Gaza's southernmost city, Rafah, in what promises to be among the most destructive phases of the war so far. Over months of offensives further north, much of Gaza's population has been squeezed into a small patch of land in and around Rafah, raising concerns drastically that the next phase of hostilities will lead to high rates of civilian casualties. Israel's allies and adversaries alike have insisted that a large-scale assault on Rafah does not go forward, but Israeli President Benjamin Netanyahu and his war cabinet appear unmoved. Israel claims that Rafah hosts thousands of Hamas fighters as well as the organization's senior leaders, and that allowing those fighters to survive unscathed would allow Hamas to reorganize and rebuild in the wake of the current conflict. Not only that, but Israel suspects that roughly 130 Israeli hostages who remain in Gaza after being abducted by Hamas nearly 6 months ago may be within Rafah as well, whether they are alive or have since died as prisoners. At present, Israel claims that it will create so-called humanitarian islands to shelter Gazans who are currently displaced into Rafah's encampments and shelters. Netanyahu himself has claimed that civilians will be given a means to leave the city. Israeli delegations have attempted to make headway with the country's international partners, including the United States, to see Israel's way clear toward the offensive that it wants. But as Israel continues to demonstrate that it won't be talked out of the offensive, concern has only grown internationally, not diminished. The United States appears to be hardening in its opposition to the anticipated Rafah offensive and pushing towards both increased aid deliveries and negotiations focused on an immediate 6-week ceasefire. All this as Israel now openly admits that the offensive into Rafah has already been authorized and could begin at any time. As it stands now, international efforts to save innocent lives in Gaza are rapidly reaching several points of no return, all at once. On the humanitarian side, deliveries of aid will need to start happening much faster, at much higher volumes and ahead of schedule, if famine is going to be averted in northern Gaza. On the military side, Israel must decide whether it will allow itself to be slowed down by international pressure against a Rafah offensive, or whether it will begin that offensive anyway and carry it out as Israel sees fit. In terms of negotiations, Israel and Hamas's attempts to work toward a ceasefire now carry massive stakes. A famine averted if the ceasefire is confirmed, or rampant starvation and potentially a ruinous battle in Rafah if the ceasefire doesn't happen. And on the international stage, Israel's biggest backer, the United States, is now in a position to choose. Will it remain in its role as Israel's sole unconditional defender despite a risk of major civilian casualties in Rafah and despite the risk of mass starvation in northern Gaza? Or will its position on the Israel-Hamas war shift in a way that all but guarantees seismic consequences for Israel going forward? Months of delaying resolution on these issues has led the world nowhere. Not to a ceasefire, not to a drawdown in hostilities, and not to distribution of aid to Gaza. This conflict cannot continue in its current state for long, and what comes next may mean the difference between peaceful resolution and complete and total ruin. And finally today, we're turning our attention to Haiti. It's been called the worst humanitarian crisis in the Western Hemisphere. Since the near-total collapse of the state in the face of a gang uprising, Haiti has plunged from dysfunction into a condition of anarchy. The UN estimates that over 360,000 people are internal refugees driven from their homes by violence. Murder rates are among the highest in the Americas, with homicides, torture, and even rape carried out on the streets in broad daylight. Summing up the situation, the executive director of UNICEF recently likened Haiti in 2024 to the film Mad Max. Haitian broadcaster Blondine Tannis meanwhile told the New York Times how, quote, "There are young kids in the streets with heavy automatic weapons. They shoot people and burn their bodies with no remorse. I don't know how to qualify that. I ask myself, what happened to this generation? Are they even human?" Yet while the random violence carried out by the newly united gangs is horrific, it may not even be the worst of Haiti's problems. Rather, that could be the threat of hunger. The World Food Programme estimates that over 40% of Haiti's 11 million citizens are food insecure, with 1.4 million on the brink of famine. In the commune of Croix de Bouquet, malnutrition is comparable to that seen in the wars in Sudan or Gaza. As local program head Jean Montimba told reporters, Haiti is one of the world's most severe food crises. Now, food insecurity isn't a wholly new experience in Haiti. Since the start of the pandemic, rates of hunger have been steadily rising, exacerbated by gang violence that has kept people trapped inside their homes. But what we're witnessing this year is unprecedented in the Caribbean nation. The unification of the gangs, the collapse of central governmental control, and spiraling violence have all combined to create a crisis beyond anything the Americas have witnessed in decades. A crisis fueled by a political class that thrives on disunity, squabbling over seats on a proposed transitional council even as their nation burns. We've covered in other recent videos the political dimension to Haiti's crisis, so we won't rehash it all here. Instead, we want to use this segment to explore how compounding factors on the ground are pushing millions towards famine in a nation just a 2-hour flight from Florida. Not that anyone could successfully fly in aid right now, even if they had the means. Since the armed uprising began earlier in March, Haiti's gangs have worked to block almost all major entrance points to the country. Airports are surrounded, the main port overrun. While it is possible to get in and out of remoter parts of the nation, like Cap Haitian in the north, gangs control almost all the roads approaching Port-au-Prince. The nearly 3 million living in the capital's metro area, in other words, are effectively cut off. As a result, the WFP is reporting that its warehouses are fast running out of stock. Attempts have been made to bring more goods in, but with dispiriting results. On Saturday, the 16th of March, UNICEF reported that a container of essential goods it had tried to ship to Haiti had been seized and looted by the gangs. According to the agency, a similar fate befell an additional 260 humanitarian containers that had been held up at the nation's main port. Given that before the latest crisis, Haiti already had to import over half its food, the armed takeover of the ports would be a disaster even in isolation. But of course, it's just one of many problems threatening to overwhelm the country. Other issues have stemmed from the gangs launching attacks on power stations around Port-au-Prince, plunging much of the city into darkness. Voice of America reports that during the past week, much of the capital was without power, a problem exacerbated by the lack of fuel to power privately owned generators. In the heavy Caribbean heat, living without electricity means watching your groceries spoil at warp speed. Now, if you or I were to find our food spoiled, we would doubtless grumble that we could just go to the store and buy some more. For many in Haiti, though, that's not an option, or at least it's only an option to take when you are truly desperate. That's because the violence and killing on the streets of Port-au-Prince is now so random and so brutal that simply stepping outside can be a death sentence. As the Times explains, many are afraid to leave their homes for fear of getting caught in the crossfire. They are hungry. They are running out of clean water and gas. They are desperate. This is a problem that affects even Haiti's professional middle class. The guys one step below the elites who until this year were able to shelter from the violence within their affluent guarded suburbs. Today, though, even relative wealth and private security isn't enough to keep the gangs at bay. On Monday the 18th, up to 12 people were murdered in the upper-crust neighborhood of Pétionville as gangs attacked residents and trashed their homes. Although the motive for the killings is unclear at the time of writing, one taxi driver who spoke to AFP news agency summed up everyone's fears, saying the dead had likely been outside, quote, searching for something to eat for their children. Try to imagine for a second how awful life would be. Having nothing in your home to feed your family, but knowing that even attempting to leave to buy bread might mean your children will never see you alive again. It's a feeling most of us likely can't even imagine. For residents of Pétionville, though, it's their new lives. Still, at least those in the wealthier suburbs have money to buy goods if they can make it to a store. The vast majority of Haitians don't even have that. This is because most people in Port-au-Prince have long lived day to day, making just enough money to buy their family's goods for that same evening and nothing more. But with violence trapping people inside their homes, more and more Haitians are unable to make even the bare minimum required to keep their children fed. Combined with spiking inflation, this has put basic goods out of the reach of ordinary people. Here are some figures from the UN. In January alone, prices jumped 25% in southern Haiti and Port-au-Prince. That's not the same as an inflation rate of 25%, which would normally mean that goods had increased by that amount since the previous year. That's a price hike of an additional quarter in just a single month. By mid-March, it's thought food prices were rising by 10% every few days. In a country as poor as Haiti, such price hikes are catastrophic. The local financial system itself is likewise under strain as the gangs launch attacks on banks. But while this all badly affects Haiti's regular citizens, there are other things the gangs are doing that will likely affect even their own members. Crazy, self-defeating things that may cause long-term damage to Haiti's ability to feed everyone, from its very poorest to its uber-rich. The craziest of all? The attacks on Artibonite. The largest of Haiti's 10 departments, Artibonite lies to the north of Port-au-Prince, stretching from the coast deep into the Haitian interior, a place of mountain ranges and valleys bisected by the surging river. It's also Haiti's breadbasket, or perhaps that should be rice basket, the place where most of the nation's staple crop of rice is grown. At least, for now it is, because evidence is mounting that a surge in gang attacks inside Artibonite is destroying farmland and causing agricultural workers to flee the department. European Space Agency satellite photos analyzed by the WFP have shown that 3,000 hectares of farmland in Artibonite were abandoned across 2023 as the gangs expanded into the region. While some of this was offset by those who fled, setting up new farms elsewhere, the overall result was a loss of agricultural capacity. 3,000 hectares is not a huge amount in the grand scheme of things, but it shows that things are trending in the wrong direction and may get worse if the gangs make a concerted push into the department. As the history of war shows us, there is almost nothing as devastating for the civilian population as the destruction of agricultural land. The reason Sudan is facing starvation now is because the civil war led to an entire harvest being lost. Back at the start of the decade, it was the famine caused by the destruction of farmland and exacerbated by government blockades that turned the Tigray War into the 21st century's deadliest conflict. So yeah, we should all be extremely worried about the situation facing Artibonite, a situation that could have impacts far beyond Haiti's own shores. Already last year, before the state fully collapsed, the numbers of people fleeing Haiti were spiking. Foreign Policy reports that 1,550 Haitians tried to make it to Central America and then onto the southern US border in July of 2023. By October, that number had climbed to 35,500. Today, the fear is that 35,500 could soon look like a drop in the ocean. If starvation really takes hold, then millions of people may feel they have no choice but to take their chances on small boats and head for Central America or Florida. Obviously, this is an outcome that nobody wants. Just recently, the US government announced $33 million in humanitarian funding to feed Haiti. Days later, the EU allocated an additional $21.9 million. Will it be enough? That's impossible to say. What we can say is that Haiti is currently facing a crisis unlike anything else in the Western Hemisphere, a crisis that seems to be only growing and may yet spill over into other nations. We can only pray that some solution is found before it is too late.